She threw a glass of red wine in my face at my own retirement dinner, in front of 63 people. And my son just sat there. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am not a man who cries easily. I spent 31 years working in commercial construction in Ontario. I poured foundations in February. I managed crews in 40 below wind chill. I buried my wife 8 years ago and kept the company running the next Monday because I didn't know what else to do. I am not soft, but standing there in the banquet room of the Millcroft Inn with Merlot dripping down my collar and 63 people going completely silent, I felt something crack open in my chest that I hadn't felt since the day they lowered Eleanor into the ground. Her name is Priya, my daughter-in-law. My son Brendan married her 3 years ago and I paid for the wedding. Not because anyone asked me to. I want to be clear about that. I paid because Eleanor would have wanted it done properly, and because Brendan is my only child, and because I genuinely believed at the time that Priya made him happy. Maybe she did. I'm not sure anymore. I'm not sure of a lot of things. Let me back up. I built Galloway Site Services from nothing. I started it at 34 with a used excavator, a second-hand pickup, and a line of credit that gave me nightmares for 2 years straight. By the time I sold it last spring, at 67, after 3 decades, it employed 41 people full-time and had contracts with 4 municipalities across Waterloo region. I am not telling you this to brag. I am telling you this because it matters to what happened, because the number on that sale matters, because Brendan knew the number. Eleanor and I never hid from him how the business worked. We taught him to save. We taught him to ask the price of things before he wanted them. We paid for his degree at Waterloo, mechanical engineering, and when he graduated, we gave him a decent used car and told him the rest was up to him. Not because we couldn't give more. Because we'd watched too many of our friends' children collapse under the weight of everything handed to them. He did well, actually. For a while. He got a good job with an infrastructure firm in Mississauga. He was responsible. He called every Sunday. He was, for a long time, exactly the son we'd raised him to be. Then he met Priya. I don't want to be unfair to her. She is intelligent. She is ambitious in the way that people who grew up without much money sometimes are. Sharp-edged. Always calculating. Always knowing what the next step is. Her family is from Brampton. Her father runs a small accounting firm. Her mother teaches at an elementary school. Nice people, honestly. I've had them over for dinner twice. There is nothing wrong with where she came from. What went wrong, I think, is what she saw when she looked at me. She didn't see a father. She saw a balance sheet. The retirement dinner was Brendan's idea. He'd organized it, booked the venue, invited colleagues, invited my old crew foreman, invited neighbors I'd known for 20 years. It was a Saturday in early October. The kind of evening the Niagara Escarpment does better than anywhere else on Earth. All amber and rust. The air just cold enough to remind you it was real. I wore the sport coat Eleanor bought me for our 30th anniversary. I spent 44 years in construction management. And the one thing this industry teaches you. We were between the main course and dessert. I'd just finished a conversation with my old site supervisor, a man named Terry, who'd worked for me for 19 years and who cried a little when he hugged me, which set me off as well. I was standing near the bar, holding a sparkling water, feeling genuinely peaceful. Priya came up beside me. She had a glass of wine in her hand, and she was wearing an expression I'd seen before, focused, deliberate, the face she puts on when she's about to negotiate something. She said she wanted to talk about the house. My house? The house Eleanor and I built in 1998 on 2 acres just outside Elora. 4 bedrooms. A proper workshop in the back. A perennial garden Eleanor spent 15 years perfecting that I have. Admittedly, got a bitly, let go a bit since she passed. It is worth, in the current market, somewhere around $1.4 million. It is also the place where I watched my wife die in the bedroom at the end of the hall, and where I still sleep on my side of the bed, and where I have no intention of going anywhere. Priya said that she and Brendan had been talking. She said the house was too big for one person. She said that there were very nice retirement communities. She actually said, retirement communities, standing in the middle of my retirement party, in Guelph and Cambridge, and that she had looked into a few of them and that they were quite lovely, actually. And that at my age, it made more sense than rattling around a 4-bedroom house by myself. I looked at her. I said, Priya, this isn't really the time or place. She said it was exactly the time and place because she'd been trying to bring it up for months and I kept changing the subject. I spent as calmly as I could that the house was mine, that I had no plans to sell it, and that this conversation was over. That is when she threw the wine in my face. Not dropped it, not spilled it, threw it. A full glass, held at chest height, released with intention. The sound it made was a small sound, just a soft splash, and then the clink of ice on the hardwood floor, but the silence that followed it was the loudest thing I have ever heard in my life. I didn't move. I want to be honest about that. I stood there with red wine running down my face and I did not move, because I genuinely could not process what had just happened. She said in a voice that was shaking, but not from remorse, from anger still, from frustration that I hadn't folded. She said, "You are a selfish old man and you are sitting on assets that could give your son and his family a real future, and you are too stubborn to see it." His family. She was pregnant. 3 months they hadn't told anyone yet. I found out that night. That was how I found out. I turned to look at Brendan. He was standing 6 feet away. He had watched all of it. He said nothing. He looked at the floor. I picked up a cloth napkin from the nearest table. I wiped my face. I set the napkin down. I took my jacket from the back of my chair and I walked out. I did not say goodbye to anyone. I drove home on the 401 with the windows down even though it was October, because I needed cold air on my face and I needed to think and I needed to not be in that room for one more second. By the time I got home, I had stopped shaking. I made a pot of tea. I sat at the kitchen table. The same table Eleanor and I bought at an auction in Fergus in 1994, 2 weeks before Brendan was born. And I thought about what I was going to do. I want to be honest with you. My first instinct was to call Brendan and give him a chance to explain. Because he is my son. Because Eleanor loved him so much, it was almost frightening. The way she loved him. Completely. Without reservation. In the way that some mothers just pour themselves into a child. And I thought about what she would say. I sat there and I actually thought about it. Seriously. As though she might answer. I think she would have said, "Don't make a decision tonight." So I didn't. I went to bed. I slept badly. I got up at 5:30, which is my habit, and I made coffee. And I called my lawyer. His name is Jeff. We've worked together for 22 years. I told him what had happened. There was a long pause on his end, and then he said, "Okay, what do you want to do?" I told him. The first thing I did was call my financial advisor. I have a portfolio from the business sale. Not all in one place, not all liquid, managed across a few different vehicles. I had named Brendan as the primary beneficiary on several of those accounts. We had a conversation that morning that took about 40 minutes, and by the end of it, the beneficiary designations had been changed. I won't tell you to whom, because that's not the point of this. The point is that it was done. The second thing I did was update my will. This is not as dramatic as it sounds. In Canada, you can update a will relatively quickly when the circumstances call for it. Jeff had it drafted within a week. Brendan was not removed entirely, but the split changed significantly. What had been 90% to him became 40%. The rest is going to the hospital foundation that cared for Eleanor in her last weeks, and to a trade scholarship fund I'd been meaning to set up for years in her name. I should have done that sooner. That's on me. The third thing I did was nothing. For 3 days, I didn't call Brendan. I didn't answer when he called me. I needed the silence. I needed to sit with what had happened without his voice in my ear trying to explain it away. He came to the house on the 4th day. He drove up the laneway around noon. I watched him from the workshop window. I was replacing a hinge on the back gate, something I'd been putting off for months. And I took my time. I finished what I was doing. I put my tools away, and then I went inside and opened the door. He looked terrible. He hadn't slept. His eyes were red and he'd clearly been crying in the car on the way over, which he does. He's always done that. Since he was small, he cries alone and then tries to look composed, and he never quite manages it. He said, "Dad." I said, "Come in." We sat at the kitchen table. He apologized. He said he should have stepped in. He said he was shocked and he froze, and he knew that wasn't good enough. He said Priya had been under a lot of pressure, that the pregnancy had been stressful, that she was scared about money, that she hadn't meant it the way it looked. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt. That's something I learned in 30 years of running a business. Let people finish. Sometimes what they say after the sentence they planned is more honest than the sentence itself. When he was done, I said, "I know you're going to be a father. Congratulations. I mean that genuinely. I'm glad about that. He started crying again. I said, I also need you to understand something. What happened at that dinner was not a misunderstanding. Your wife threw wine in my face in front of people I have known for 30 years, and she told me I was selfish for not giving up the home where your mother died. That is not a bad day. That is a choice. And the way you responded, by standing there and saying nothing, that is also a choice. He said he knew. I said, I've made some changes to the accounts, to the will, not to punish you, because I needed to make decisions that reflect what actually matters to me, and I should have reviewed them years ago anyway. Your mother would have told me the same thing. He asked if we were done. His voice was very small when he asked it. He sounded the way he did at 7 years old when he thought he was really in trouble. I said, I don't know yet. I need time. And Priya owes me an apology. A real one. Not a text message, not through you. When that happens, we can talk about what comes next. He left about an hour later. I stood in the doorway and watched his car go back down the laneway. And I felt something that I still don't have a clean word for. Not satisfaction. Not grief exactly. Something between the two. Something that felt like the beginning of a very long, honest conversation that I hadn't been willing to have for years. 3 weeks later, Priya called me. Not a text. A call. She asked if she could come by on her own, without Brendan, and I said yes. She sat in the same chair at the kitchen table. She looked at her hands for a long time before she spoke. And then, she told me something I hadn't known. That she had been terrified, since early in the pregnancy, about what kind of stability they could offer a child on 2 salaries in the current market, with their rental costs, with her mat leave coming, with the way housing prices in the GTA had gone. She said she had built a story in her head where I was the solution, and when I resisted the story, she had aimed that fear directly at me, which was not fair, and she knew it, and she was sorry. I spent 34 years in construction management. I said, I understand fear. I've been afraid most of my adult life. Afraid the business would fail. Afraid I couldn't provide. Afraid of losing a mother. Afraid of losing her again every time I walk past that bedroom door. Fear is not an excuse for what you did, but it is a reason, and there's a difference. She nodded. I said, the house is mine and it will stay mine for as long as I want it. That is not negotiable. But when the baby comes, I would like to be involved, if you'll have me. I am not interested in holding grudges against the mother of my grandchild. I am interested in being honest with both of you about what I need and what I can offer. Can we start there? She said yes. I don't know if that means everything is fixed. I don't think it works that way. I think what it means is that we are all, finally, being straight with each other. Which is something we probably should have been doing for the past 3 years, and I include myself in that, because I was too easy on Brendan for too long and I knew it. Eleanor used to say that the most important thing you can teach a child is that the world doesn't rearrange itself around their fear. You have to rearrange yourself. You have to figure out what you actually need and go after it the right way. She was right about most things. She was right about that. The baby is due in April. A girl. They're going to name her Eleanor, which they told me last Sunday over the phone, and which I was not prepared for at all, and which meant I had to set the phone down for a minute and look out the window at the Perelini garden. I'm going to fix that garden up before she arrives. I think it's time. I still think about that October evening sometimes. The Merlot on my collar, the silence in that room, my son looking at the floor. Not with bitterness, the way I might have a year ago. More like you'd think about a storm that finally broke something that had been straining for a long time. What I've come to understand is that what happened at that dinner wasn't really about the house. The house was just the thing Priya pointed at. What it was actually about was a conversation none of us had been willing to have. About money, about expectations, about what I owed my son and what he owed me, and what any of us actually owe each other when love is in the room but honesty isn't. I'll be straight with you. I wasn't innocent in all of this. I'd been easy on Brendan in ways I told myself were generous but were actually just avoidance. I paid for things and called it love and didn't ask enough questions about whether I was helping him grow or just making it easier for him not to. Eleanor used to nudge me about it gently, and I'd nod and then I'd write another check. That pattern had consequences. Not just for what Priya thought she could get away with, but for the kind of man my son had learned to be when things got hard. The thing about cause and effect is that it doesn't wait for you to be ready. You make choices for 20 years and then one night, someone throws a glass of wine in your face and you're standing there in the wreckage of all of it at once. But here's what I also know. Brendan came to that kitchen table and he told the truth. That took something real. It would have been easier for him to stay away, to let his wife manage the fallout, to wait and see if I'd soften on my own. Instead, he drove out to Elora and he sat across from me and he said, I know that wasn't good enough. That's not nothing. That is, actually everything. Because the willingness to face what you did wrong, without making excuses, without waiting for someone to let you off the hook, is the hardest kind of honest there is. And Priya, for her part, came alone. She didn't send Brendan ahead to soften me up. She sat in that chair and she told me the truth about the fear underneath the anger, which I respect. Not because fear justifies anything, but because it takes a certain kind of clarity to look at your own worst moment and say, this is what drove me, and I was wrong. I've had time now to think about what I want the rest of my life to look like. I want to see my granddaughter grow up. I want to be the kind of grandfather Eleanor would have been proud of. I want to be present in a way I wasn't always able to be when the business was running my life. But I also want to be honest. With Brendan. With Priya. With myself. The changes I made to the accounts and the will weren't punishments. They were me finally making decisions that matched what I actually valued, instead of what was convenient. That's something I should have done years ago, and it took a glass of wine to the face to make me do it. I think that's what people miss when they hear a story like this. They want the revenge part, and yes, there's some satisfaction in that. I won't pretend otherwise. But the part that actually matters is what comes after. The hard conversations. The willingness to stay at the table. The decision to build something better instead of just burning down what didn't work. That garden is coming along. I put in new peonies along the back fence last weekend. Eleanor's favorite. In April, I'll be holding a baby girl with her name. That's not nothing either.